Welcome back to another episode of Writing Thoughts. For this week, I am delving into a simple trick I picked up for writing and world building that is simple but can be potentially evocative if used right. Most writers are used to world building, particularly if they're working in the speculative genres such as fantasy and science fiction. But to an extent, every fiction author does it. We all have to build the world that the story plays around in, even if those building blocks are taken from real places and the mortar that holds the story together is based on real people. Most writers do it with research, digging up facts, running a few numbers, and doing a lot of heavy lifting and construction that a majority of which will never need to be used in the narrative. And there is nothing wrong with that. But it is a hard, detailed approach to world building that can sometimes end up leading to an excess of exposition. While I was once an advocate and avid supporter of the idea of detailed, realism-driven world design and building, I no longer think that way. I think it is still a valid approach and there is absolutely nothing wrong with taking a Tolkien-style methodology to making the worlds your stories inhabit. But sometimes, this is not the right approach. Sometimes you just want to sit back and have as minimal a world reference as Robert Howard did when he wrote his original Conan the Barbarian stories. Just a broad strokes essay and nothing more. In recent years, I've leaned closer to a Howard-inspired softer approach to world building that makes use of words and phrases to evoke the right feeling. This works because it puts the heavy lifting of setting the mood and feel on the imaginations of the reader. It can also add a sense of authenticity to the setting that doesn't require you to slip in a dozen or so details that you did a lot of research on. Let me give an example from one of my own books, Ashwood. The setting is heavily inspired by Gothic horror, which includes the overall level of learning available to the characters. Simply put, it isn't as advanced as our world and I needed a way to evoke and establish that without doing a lot of exposition. To evoke an earlier time with as few words as possible, I made the deliberate choice to avoid more recent terms like medicine and the sciences. Instead, I went with having the characters speak of academic fields as being under a broad term of philosophy. Instead of doctors, I consistently used the word physician. Instead of medicine, they were trained in a physician's philosophy. The words feel slightly archaic and outdated, to better evoke the kind of environment and time I wanted to go for. I do this more often in my book Children of the Wolf, where I use Latin terms for an assortment of things, again to establish facets of the setting without doing excess exposition. The use of Latin terms helped solidify the Roman inspiration of the setting, once again doing a bit of heavy lifting with minimal exposition required. It also helped paint a picture of a very different world and day-to-day practices, such as mention of the metal tools used to scrape off dirt and sweat rather than the use of towels that most people would be more familiar with. With just a little word, it's possible to evoke a different way of living, and with it, imply a different mindset. In my opinion, it's the little things such as these that make it easier to convince readers of the reality of a fantasy setting. However, your word choice can also do a bit more in terms of heavy lifting and world building. It can also help add a layer of authenticity to the dialogue. Turns of phrase, expressions, and choice of metaphor can be an immersive tool, yet something that most people wouldn't pay much notice. An example of this comes from a conversation I had with a friend who was making a desert nomad clan for his game of Dungeons and Dragons. And I commented that the way they talked made them jarring, like they weren't really desert nomads. When he asked why, I pointed out that they still said they slept like logs when someone asked them if they slept well as an example of them not talking like they've spent their whole lives in the desert. When was the last time anyone saw a log in the desert? It was a jarring detail, and I suggested he change it to reference something that would be found in the desert, like a dead donkey or maybe a rock. It adds a bit more authenticity in small ways, and adds a touch of local color. Every culture has its own metaphors, its own comparisons, and its own turns of phrase. Making a few of these, even just making variations on common ones, can go a long way towards making a more immersive experience. It also helps build the world. It won't be as grand as the creation of an elaborate history and placing ancient ruins or cities so old that no one can remember when they were founded anymore, but it still does a great deal of heavy lifting. It paints an idea of what the people are like, which is often just as important as the history and facts of a setting. Maybe it's just me, but I think readers are more interested in the people first and the history of the world they live in second. There's one final way where word choice can do world building, with this method also making it easier to distinguish characters from each other. With the right words added or removed, you can make distinctions between things like class, level of education, and hint at personality traits. Here's an example. One character is saying their age. If they just say they're 13, it feels natural and common. It sounds like the way most people would answer if you ask them their age, and that can help the character feel grounded. If they say they're 13 years old or 13 years of age, it adds a layer of formality and even stuffiness to the speech pattern. Depending on context, it might suggest they grew up in a formal environment or may be trying to affect a more archaic speech pattern. At the very least, it means they're very grammatically correct. If they say they're 13 summers old, it can sometimes evoke an older period by suggesting that people measure time by the passing of the seasons, rather than a more formal calendar system. Or, in some cases, evoke a more romantic worldview. Writers will inevitably agonize over word choice. I think it's part of who we are and what we do. But sometimes, we don't pay this much attention to the words we choose to build the world that we put our stories in, and that's a shame. Just a few words can do so much heavy lifting, if you know what you're doing and use the right ones. And you won't even need to spend so much time looking things up in that obsessive way people do when they're trying to emulate Tolkien and build a world down to the last, most minute detail. Why do all that, when all you need is the right word in the right place? And with that, this week's episode of Writing Thoughts is complete. Thank you for listening, Mecha-Author of birds, humans, and lizards. If you enjoyed this or, God forbid, learned something, do consider leaving a like or a comment, or subscribing for more rambling. You can also check out the assortment of links in the description if you want to show your support in other ways, like buying one of my books or backing me on Patreon. See you next week.